I want to welcome you back to another study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're so thankful for you tuning in and joining with us in this study. We've been going through this study for a couple of months now. We're nearing the last few chapters of the book. If you're just now tuning in with us, I would invite you to go back and start all the way back at chapter 1. Just walk through the Gospel of Matthew with us as we study through that. We noted as we began looking in chapter 20 that Jesus is now headed towards Jerusalem. And so we are nearing the last week of Jesus's life on this earth before his crucifixion. And as we draw near to that, we're going to see the events kind of slow down in the way they're being recorded for us. Time is slowing down as far as how Matthew's observing it. And so we'll note that as we go along. In our class on Wednesday, we started in on Matthew chapter 20. And one of the things that we looked at there towards the end of the chapter is when the mother of James and John comes to Jesus and asks for a position of honor for her sons in the kingdom. Now, we noted that's not without basis, because James and John certainly are among that inner circle. They are very close to Jesus. But Jesus, his response indicates that comes with some terrible responsibility, that it is not just honor, but it is a burden that comes along with that honor. In fact, Jesus himself would bear a very tremendous burden in the crucifixion in order to have his place in the kingdom. And so it is with these brothers, James and John, that Jesus asked them whether they're able to bear that burden. He asked it this way, though: can you drink the cup? They may not know what that means, but they certainly jump in and say, yes, we can drink the cup. And so Jesus says, you will drink the cup. And they, along with the other apostles, indeed would suffer in order to obtain their places of honor in the kingdom. James being the first martyr, but then John having to watch the martyrdom of all his fellow apostles as he goes through life and ends up being the longest living apostle as far as we know. Well, after that conversation between the mother of these sons of Zebedee and Jesus, the other apostles heard all of that. And Luke, what is their response to hearing that conversation?
In verse 24, it says that the 10 became indignant with the two brothers. And, the New American Standard Bible uses the word indignant. And as I read through this, I kind of just think that maybe they didn't fully understand, just like you were saying, that they didn't know how the responsibility that they were going to have in the very near future. But I still, in this moment, I still feel like even though he went through some of that explanation, they still don't understand. Because, I mean, for me, if I understood what he just said, I honestly may just think, I'm glad that I didn't actually go through with that and go that far as to ask that question. But again, they are indignant, and I do think it's because they don't fully understand, like what you were saying, what Jesus is trying to tell them, the burden that they are going to have to bear being in the places that they are. And really what they just heard was when Jesus said to the two brothers, my cup you shall drink. You shall be the ones to drink it. And so, again, I think they misunderstood still, but maybe their annoyance also came from the fact that before they've asked who will be the greatest, and here is the mother coming up and just saying outright, please let them be essentially the greatest. Let them sit at your right and at your left. So maybe, and I think from the verses right after this verse, you see that it does have something to do with their attitudes when it comes to who will be the greatest.
Yeah, so maybe they're frustrated not just at the asking of the question, but as you pointed out, Jesus's answer to the question, which seems to indicate if you're not paying attention, you don't understand exactly what's going on, that they're going to get a really nice position. They're going to get to drink the cup. They're going to get to be right by him. And they don't realize that what Jesus is talking about is suffering. And it's just, it continues to illustrate that they really haven't grasped. Not only James and John, but all of the apostles. Because like you said, if they'd grasped it, they would be like so many of us often when we see somebody else ask a stupid question and get that answer that we don't want to get, we would say, whew, okay, glad that they got that, not me. So they express that frustration, then that prompts another response from Jesus to the apostles at large. And David, what is his response to their frustration?
So in response to his frustration, he calls them all together, and basically he's going to give them another lesson on how they should really be viewing things and trying to get everything put into perspective. Because if you look in verse 25, he's telling them that even the Gentiles that have rulers, they have rulers that are over them. And so you have people that are exercising control over everybody on this planet. And what he's trying to get them to understand is that that's not the way it's going to be. You're here to serve others. No matter how great you think you are, no matter great I am, I'm still here to serve. Jesus is letting them know that he's there to be a servant and not to necessarily to be served. I mean, when Jesus came to earth, he's serving the Father, and also at the same time, he's serving us because he's giving us what we needed so desperately. And what we desperately needed was that salvation and for him to go to that cross. And I think that's what he's trying to get across to them.
Yeah, and so he points, he says, you're thinking about this leadership, honor, titles, the way the Gentiles do, the way the world does. Don't think of it that way. And notice there particularly how he closes that out. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. That's the third time here in this context. We start at the last verse of chapter 19. Come on down to verse 16 of chapter 20. And now here, an iteration of that same phrase, the first will be last. And so you see, we're still on the same theme. All through this chapter, it's first shall be last. He starts it out that way. If we were to just remember that the chapter breaks are not there in the original, if we were to just start there in that last verse of chapter 19, it sort of introduces that idea on the heels of what he'd already been talking about. And look at how long he's been spending on this. And think of it this way, how long Matthew's been spending on this, right? Because Matthew is putting these stories together for us. And so what he's done is he has spent a great deal of time pressing home this point that Jesus pressed home. One thing that I think we haven't mentioned maybe enough in studying this, Matthew was there, right? Not all of the Gospels was the one writing it actually there. But Matthew was, John was as well. But he would be writing these things as someone who remembered receiving. He would be writing these things as one of the ones who was frustrated, and then one of the ones who got this story told to him, and who no doubt had his perspective changed later on. And can you imagine Matthew looking back at his own self at this point going, oh man, and writing out what Jesus said in response, realizing how little he knew back then and how much he had come to know as he reflects back on those teachings of Jesus. So he's trying to get them to just shift their focus, shift their concept of what all of this means. Service, that is the foundation of Jesus's leadership. And that is completely upside down from what the world thinks. Well, then they leave Jericho. And remember, they had come down. They were over on the other side of the Jordan in Perea. Jericho is there on the western side of the Jordan. So we're back over we're heading towards Jerusalem, right? So we were on the eastern side of the Jordan. Jericho's on the western side of the Jordan. Incidentally, that would have been the same path that the children of Israel took when they came into the promised land. They crossed over the Jordan, and Jericho is the first city that they took. And then they went on up the mountain over into the territory to Ai, and from there on to conquer the middle territory. So Jesus is taking a similar path as that of the children of Israel when they entered the promised land. I don't think that's by accident. Nevertheless, as they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him, and there were two blind men sitting on the road. So we've got a large crowd, we've got these two blind men, and they hear that it's Jesus who is passing by, and they cry out. And when they do, Jim, how do they address Jesus?
they said, have mercy on us, Lord. And he said, the Son of David. And he keeps passing, and then they say it again. And it made me think about, the fact that they're proclaiming him as Lord, but also the Son of David. Going back into 2 Samuel, it said, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, this is talking to David, I will set up your seed after you, who will come up from your body, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So they recognized who he was and that he's the Son of David. This is leading to his kingdom that's going to be lasting forever.
Yes, and so again, we've mentioned this before several times that Matthew highlights the kingship of Jesus, and here is a miracle that involves the recognition of that kingship. As you say, they recognize him as Lord, but a particular type of Lord, right? So it's like there are lords, there are people with authority over other people in this day and age. They're not just saying you are a man of great authority. No, they're saying you're the Son of David. You're the king. And so they honor him in that way as he's passing by. That's what they're crying out. Well, as you say, they cry it out multiple times. And so then Jesus stops and he says, what do you want me to do for you? Now, that is first of all, why does Jesus even need, or does he need to ask that question? And then based on that, why do you think he does answer that question, Luke?
Well, ultimately, we know that God, he already knows all the answers. Whenever God asks questions, it's not like he's trying to add to partial information. He already knows. Generally, when he asks questions, it's for, well, always, not generally, it's always for our benefit. Whether it be for the blind man specifically, or the crowd around him, or even for us in application. But when it comes to when he asks them what they want him to do for them, and they answer, Lord, we want our eyes to be open. Especially with how much, maybe in Luke it talks more about this, but we've talked about it already in this class, how often it's mentioned that the blind will be made to see, or those who should know better are blind to the truth, especially with these groups that try to constantly come at Jesus, and they just don't get it. They just don't see what should be so clear, especially for them, should they really know the law like they claim to. And if like the Pharisees or the Sadducees, those who would claim to be the religious elite. And yet, even for those people that would be so blind, if they came to, as we already talked about, the titles that they give to Jesus, this is, I mean, they are calling out to him in faith. And it's clear that this is a real and honest faith. And so even if the Pharisees, if they would come at Jesus in this way, in an honest way, he would be able to do the same thing for them. And so essentially, I think one of the points we're to get from this is that those who are honest will get a response from Jesus. And those who knock at the door, the door will be open. But also, one thing that I think is just a beautiful note, at the end of verse 34, it says that when Jesus was moved with compassion, he touches their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight. And what do they do as soon as they regain their sight? They follow after Jesus. And I just think that's a beautiful moment. Just the fact that, what do they do as soon as they get it? They use what they've just been given to follow him. And I just think that's a beautiful thought.
Yeah. And your point about honesty is so well taken. The idea that if you can recognize your problem and cry out to Jesus to fix that problem, you make an honest assessment of that, he is responsive to that. And I think about John 9 in comparison to this. At the end of that story where Jesus has healed the blind man, the Pharisees say, are we too blind? And Jesus says, no. If you were blind, I could make you see. Right? And so here again, remember that there's this crowd here. All right? It's not just Jesus and these two men. There's a crowd. And so in front of everybody, he says, what do you want me to do? Open our eyes. And I can imagine Jesus just letting that sink in. They want me to open their eyes. I can do that. Let me show you. And you would hope that echo would resonate with people, and that people who are not physically blind would go home that day thinking, I need him to open my eyes. The four of us and everybody watching this, I hope that we go home today thinking, I need him to open my eyes. That's the idea of every miracle that Jesus performs. Releasing from bondage, healing from diseases, whatever the case is, Jesus can do that for me at a spiritual level. And so, and I do appreciate the point you added there of the following, that when he does that for us, what response is there but to get up and follow? And so we appreciate that as well. Well, that brings us to chapter 21. And here is a reasonable chapter break where we turn our attention to a tremendous event in the history of the life of Jesus. And that is his entrance into Jerusalem. This is his last entrance. This is not his only visit to Jerusalem, obviously, but it is his last entrance into Jerusalem. At least that's not to say he doesn't come and go throughout the week, but he stays in this area. He is here to stay for the remainder of his life, which is not very long after this. So he comes into Jerusalem, and he comes in as the king. He comes in coming to establish his throne. And so we have expectations for that. We have expectations as to what that might look like. Now, remember how close in proximity we are to the stories that Matthew has just told us about the first being last and the servant being the greatest. And so he's put all of that into juxtaposition, and then right on the heels of that, he comes into, now Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and he begins to describe what that looks like. And one of the things that is described for us is that he comes in having told his disciples to go get a donkey and a colt, and he rides in on the colt of that donkey. Now, David, why does he do that?
Well, basically, as he tells us there in verse 4, it was done to fulfill the prophecy. And that prophecy was spoken by the prophet Zechariah, where if we go to Zechariah chapter 9, in verse 9 and 10, he tells us that. It says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, a foal of a donkey." And then interesting, in verse 10, it says, "I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow shall be cut off. He shall speak peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth." So what an amazing prophecy that is, that, Jesus comes in, and as you follow along, you see the response from the crowd that happened to be there. But Jesus comes in, almost not really as his high watermark, but at a point to where he is being recognized as fulfilling that prophecy and as being that king that was to deliver them.
Yes. Yeah, and he is fulfilling that prophecy, and yet in fulfilling that prophecy, he is probably fulfilling a prophecy that would have been preferred to be overlooked, because this is not the way people want their king to come into town. There are many who do recognize him. There are those who do throw down the palm branches before him and shout Hosanna, who are overjoyed with excitement at the arrival of their king. And they are not diminished in their excitement because he is riding on a donkey, even the colt, the foal of a beast of burden, as we see there from the prophecy. And it is a lowly station. And I appreciate you bringing in the context there, because it contrasts it with chariots and horses. He's not coming in like the world's sort of victor, like the world's sort of king might come into town with all of the sort of military-looking strength. No, he's on a donkey which incidentally is not historically looking at Israel was not as lowly as we might have it in our minds, but it came to mean more and more of that, and certainly would have been the case in this day, that it was more of a beast of burden as opposed to the actual kind of animal that you might ride. But not just that, he's riding the young donkey, right? And I don't know how many of you or our audience has ever been on a donkey, but very often your feet aren't that far from the ground. You take a young one, it can almost look comical. It does not look majestic. I can say that for sure. To get on the back of a donkey, and they're not taking long strides like a horse. There's just this little sort of a trot and gallop, and so it does look silly even. But that's the idea, is that he is lowly, and so there is not that prestige to look at him, and yet there were those willing to accept that, those willing to say, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." And when he entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." I think it's worth mentioning at this point that here he is in Jerusalem receiving accolades far and wide. And the crowds, what are they crying out? Hosanna. A week later, crowds among the same people will be shouting, "Crucify." That is how quickly and fickle people can be. David, you said the high water mark. It is, from the standpoint of maybe the adoration of the crowds, it's certainly the high water mark. It seems in Jerusalem. Here is this moment of excitement. Plotting is going to be happening for the rest of the week. Well, Jesus comes in, having received all of this praise and adoration. And so, as any good politician, he capitalizes on that by catering to the people and shows them that he's not here to shake things up, right? Now, he comes to the temple, and Jim, I kind of stepped over your question there, Jim, talking about the reaction of the crowd. Let me move on then to Luke here. Luke, what did he do when he arrived at the temple?
It says that when he rode to the temple, he drove out. The text says, "Those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den.'" And in verse 13, there are two different Old Testament texts used in verse 13, or that Jesus is kind of using the same language or similar language. And that first one, "My house shall be called a house of prayer," is from Isaiah 56 and verse 7. And then in the second part where he says, "You are making it a robber's den," comes from Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11. And the reason I wanted to note that is because in verse 12, we see just everything that shouldn't be at the temple, all the attitudes and the things that don't belong there. It's people who are not there honestly, for honest reasons. They're not there to honestly obey and worship God, and they're misusing and abusing this place. And so ultimately he drives out those who are misusing this place, using it for silly reasons. And in fact, I think that when you read through verse 12 of the things that they're doing, you see this in the Old Testament. You see this especially, I think my mind goes back to when Israel had returned from captivity, and I believe it's Amos, maybe Nehemiah, who has to say, "We can't be doing these things." We when they're talking about some of the things, like when they're trying to sell on the Sabbath and they're just waiting for the next day, it's the same kind of attitudes and it's the same kind of actions, I feel like, that we see in verse 12. And so he drives these people out. And in verse 13, he uses these two texts, which I think they would understand the context of, in the context of Isaiah chapter 56 and verse 7. In that chapter, it's talking about people who are who again are not being honest worshipers of God. And in fact, the previous verse in verse 6, in Isaiah, it says that they were people who were offering sacrifices to Baal. And so you bring that to today, and hearing that from Jesus, well, that would be a pretty harsh statement to take in. And then in Jeremiah chapter 7, also again, that was Jeremiah 7. That was Jeremiah 7. In Isaiah chapter 56, he says, "For my house will be called a house of prayer for all the peoples." And Stephen, you may be able to add to this, but something I read about this was when the money changers had to do with changing out the money, Gentile money, into appropriate or proper Jewish shekels. And so maybe you could add to that. But what I read about that was when you get to Isaiah 56 and verse 7, it says, "For my house will be called the house of prayer for all the peoples." And in the context of that chapter, God is talking about those, even foreigners, who are going to come in, who he's going to invite in. And so I just thought that was interesting to note, just what he brings in with that context.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation there. It's always helpful to go get the context, just like I was talking about David, to go get the context of those quotes and to see, that very often the context brings in even more. Every once in a while there's a verse and it's just almost plucked right out from its context and applied to Jesus. But most often the context spreads out, and that too adds layers. And so I appreciate you bringing that in. Jim, thinking about this, Jesus has endured so much and taken so much insult and will take more. A lot of times people look at this moment and use it as a defense for us to be reactionary, for us to say, to sort of defend outbursts of anger. But we know Jesus is not somebody that has outbursts of anger. Why do you think particularly Jesus took offense at this moment when he so rarely does take offense?
I think this was more of a righteous anger. This is his house, and these people are, stealing from others to make a profit. He is basically cleaning house.
Yes.
And it's a righteous act that he's doing.
Yeah, and it's on behalf of his Father. Right, it's not me personally. And if you read the imprecatory Psalms, sometimes we have a hard time with the imprecatory Psalms because they are filled with very strong language. But so often, David is angered on behalf of God. Personally, he even says in some of those imprecatory Psalms, it's not me that he's concerned about, but it is God's kingdom, it is God's name. In so many ways, he is angered on behalf of God, and so he calls judgment in that way. And so I think that we need to see this moment as the isolated incident that it is. That is not to say that there is no time for anger, but to note what an anomaly this kind of anger is in the life of Jesus. That makes us want to perk up and say, whoa, what sort of thing would make Jesus angry? Because I'm going to tell you, there's some other things that you would have thought would have made him angry that certainly didn't. And then this does. This provokes this kind of reaction. And I would suggest that in general, that if we want people to take note of us, if you're raising children, you're coaching a ball team, you're a boss, whatever, if you're getting angry all the time, it means less and less and less every time. But when we read through the life of Jesus, this ought to stand out and just, it is something that grabs the attention as something unusual and therefore worthy of note from the standpoint of what provokes him. And it ought to be that anger is unusual in us, that it ought to take an insult towards God, not towards me personally, but towards God, in order to provoke a kind of visceral reaction like this. Well, he drives them out, and on the heels of that, it says, the blind and lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. When the chief priests and scribes saw these wonderful things that he had done, and the children were shouting in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, what was their reaction, David? You see Jesus, he's healing people are crying out his praises. How do they react?
They apparently get very angry with him, very mad. As we've kind of gone through this discourse of Jesus's life, we've seen that the scribes and Pharisees and other elders, they've always tried to seek some way that they're able to either trap or corner him or some way to get Jesus. And this just seems another thing for them to get infuriated about, even though they really have no right reason to be mad. I mean, like you just got through explaining the verses before this, Jesus had that righteous anger driving out all those people that were doing business wrongfully in his father's house. And then all of a sudden he heals these people that need the help. He has these little children calling him by who he truly is. And then these people get mad at him for that. It seems that, obviously everything that they're focused on is wrong and in the wrong direction, that they're not willing to allow to be able to recognize that Jesus is who he says he is, and that they're so focused on losing their place or their stature with the people that they just can't take anything that Jesus does for good.
That's right. Yeah. Being so angry and hateful that you cannot see any good that a man does. We don't have any of that happens today. No, we do. But can you imagine being so hateful that you can't see good in a man who literally only does good? That is a particular level of hatred. There's not one wicked thing that this man did, and yet they can see no good. So they're intent on their hatred. Well, we go on from there, and first of all, it says Jesus' response to their indignance. It says, "Do you hear what these children are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. And have you never read out of the mouth," or rather they asked Jesus, "Do you hear what they're saying?" Right? So they're asking him, "Don't you hear what they're saying?" Jesus says, "Yes. And have you never read out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself?" And he left them and went out of the city to Bethany and spent the night there. I love whether it's Jesus saying, if you shut these up, even the very rocks would praise. In this place, it's, do you hear what the babies are saying? Yes, they know. And the sort of implication is, why do you not? And why does it have to be children saying this? Why isn't it the leaders who see this and say this? And so I'm reminded of John's words, or the words of Gabriel, rather, in the book of Luke about John, that he would turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children. We generally would say, and Malachi does put it both ways, we generally would say turn the hearts of the children back to the fathers. But here's one of those cases where maybe the hearts of the fathers need to return to the children. And they need to listen up to what the babes are saying at this particular moment. They go on from there, and the next story Matthew records for us is, in the morning, he was returning to the city, and he became hungry, and he saw a fig tree out there by itself on the road, and he comes up to it, and he found nothing on it except leaves. And so he said, "No longer shall there be any fruit from you." And at once the fig tree withered. Now, Jim, why do you suppose he did that?
Well, obviously he's expecting this fig tree to be producing fruit. It's got leaves on it. It's the season, and so it's not bearing anything. And so he says, "You're not going to produce anything ever again." And I look at it as kind of a cautionary tale for us as Christians. Do we have the appearance of bearing fruit, but we're not bearing fruit? It's how worse is it for us if Christ comes to us and sees us bearing nothing? What is he going to do with us? So I look at that. I know it's going to be a little bit later as an act of faith that this happened. But for us as Christians, this is a cautionary tale.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to make that connection of faith. But I think you're absolutely correct. Jesus is not just being like, it's not like some petty thing where he comes up and he wants some food, even though that would be aggravating, right? I mean, if you think there's going to be fruit there and then it turns out that it's giving you false impressions, and so there's nothing there. And so that is frustrating. And so Jesus does, I think, what most of us would do if we had the power and we got angry at a tree. We would just say, hey, wither up and die. And then the tree actually does. But remember, we're in Jerusalem. And of all the places where the nation of Israel looked like it was fruitful but was not, Jerusalem would have been at the head of that list. That they had the presentation. They've got the temple. They've got all the trappings. They've got the council, the Sanhedrin, all the finery of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They've got the outward appearance, but there's nothing there. And so I really think that, as you say, a cautionary tale. It's a cautionary tale for us. Indeed, it was a cautionary tale right then at that moment, which is that this is what's about to happen to Jerusalem. They bear no fruit, and this will be Jesus' response. Well, speaking to the connection that you mentioned of faith, it tells us that seeing this, his disciples were amazed and said, how did this happen? How did the tree wither all at once? And what is Jesus' response to that, Luke?
So in verse 21, he answers them saying, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen. And all the things you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. So essentially what I think it comes down to is their faith, and the faith that he talks about in line with prayer. And I think this is a reoccurring theme even in Matthew, because as we're going to see when you get to the garden and Jesus is praying alone and he is telling them, you remember to pray, and they don't. And we see what happens after the fact. And maybe we think, well, if they had prayed, they would have had more strength. But even in the past, when Jesus has to exorcise the demon that they could not exercise themselves, and they're questioning that, and they're trying to figure out why they couldn't exorcise that demon that he was able to. And it came back at the end of that account. He says, but these kind can only be done by prayer and fasting. And so again, I think it constantly, faith and prayer, they just go together. This teaching of prayer, at least, go together. They're tied together, as he says in verse 22. And just this idea of having faith and do not doubt. I can only imagine what went through Jesus's mind. This past Sunday, you were talking about Jesus calming the storm, and I just can't imagine that mindset of having that level of faith. I want to be someone who has as much faith as you could. I want to be someone where you could point and say, that person right there, they have true faith in God. I don't think I'd ever have enough faith to say, be still, or I'm going to be okay from this storm. I mean, just being in the South, the short time I've been in, it has been scary when I hear the thunder, constantly roll. And I just can't imagine that mindset of Jesus being able to say, it's calm, you be still, and no doubt. And yet Jesus is calling us to get to that point of, if you have faith, then you won't doubt that this will happen. Now, not that every prayer is going to be answered in the exact way that we want, because often we have the wrong motivations, but it will be answered in the right way, in God's way, with God's will. But I may have gone a different direction than you meant for this to go, but that I can't help but notice the tie between, when he talks about this kind of faith, how it coincides with prayer.
Yeah. And I am reminded, for instance, of their lack of faith in casting out the demon, and Jesus telling them that with fasting and prayer, this kind of demon can be cast out. I might just add an element here, that if we think of this in connection with the withering of the tree, and remember in verse 18, he is returning to the city. Now, Jerusalem is a mountain, right? The mountain of Jerusalem, and they go up to Jerusalem. And so here they are going up the mountain to Jerusalem. And he makes this fig tree wither, and they say, wow, how do you do that? How do you accomplish that? And I wonder if Jesus' answer is not more weighted than just the simple observation that you can do incredible things if you have faith. But he says, if you have faith, you could say to this mountain, what mountain? Jerusalem. That's where they are. This mountain. You could say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea. Well, if you look at prophetic language, then that is the language of destruction. The sea is the abyss. That's where things go away and they are no more. And so here Jesus has just made the fig tree, representative, I believe, of Israel, most pointedly of Jerusalem. And he says, you're not producing fruit, wither and die. And they say, how do you do that? And he goes, well, if you have enough faith, and I think this is a little bit dark, but if you have enough faith, you could say to this mountain, to Jerusalem, the pinnacle of Israel, be gone. And it would. And eventually that's exactly what Jesus will say. And that mountain of Jerusalem will be cast into the sea. And Jerusalem, as they know it, as it exists at that moment, will be no more. And I think he's going to get into that more, of course, as we go along, especially as we get over into chapter 24. We'll see the description of that mountain being taken up and cast into the sea, of it being utterly destroyed. And so, as in many cases, maybe they're just curious about the power, and Jesus is addressing that, but then also pointing their attention to the point of why he withered the fig tree, which is to illustrate what's going to happen to Jerusalem. So I think maybe there's a combined lesson there. What's on the surface, and then maybe something beneath the surface there as well. Well, it's a good stopping place. We come next to Jesus entering into the temple again, and another confrontation with the chief priests and elders. We'll pick up there in our Wednesday night class. As I've mentioned before, we're having those live in our auditorium now, but we are streaming those, and so we invite you, especially if you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel, then you'll get a notification as soon as that goes live, and you'll be able to follow along with us on Wednesday nights. Even if you're not able to check in with us live on Wednesday nights, those are still on YouTube to go back and check in later. And so we invite you to do that, to keep up with us as we're going along. We'll pick up there in verse 23 of chapter 21. We certainly, again, appreciate you tuning in, appreciate these guys joining in with us, and we hope that we'll have another opportunity that we'll be able to continue to study these through the Gospel of Matthew together, and that these studies are helpful and effective for you. Thank you again so much for joining us.